Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping in for, well, one of the most tumultuous and consequential 4-month periods in modern history.
That's putting it mildly.
We've taken the archives, all the research you shared, and really tried to organize it into a chronological map of the very beginning of the Second World War. We're talking about that critical span from September through December 1939.
And this is a deep dive into acceleration. I think that's the key word here.
Acceleration. I like that.
Yeah, because while the fighting officially erupts on, September 1st, 1939, this 4-month window is where the total systematic conflict truly reveals its face.
It's not just a border dispute anymore.
Not at all. We are charting history moving at a terrifying speed. It leaps from diplomatic failure and a kind of wishful thinking straight into mechanized total war and, frankly, systematic atrocity.
What's really remarkable about studying this era, and the source materials stress this point, is how different it is from, say, researching ancient conflicts, the myths of the Greeks or the battles for Troy.
Right, where you're piecing together fragments.
Exactly. Here, everything is so thoroughly documented. We have archive images from every single stage, official documents, and this is so crucial, we can still connect with living survivors, people who can share stories of comradeship, of hardship, and just the sheer human cost.
And that proximity to the past is essential, isn't it? It stops the lessons from becoming, abstract.
Yeah.
We aren't just reading names and dates off a page. We are analyzing a recent past that provides a complete, if often horrifying, picture of the political choices that led to this explosion.
But as you rightly point out, we are racing ahead if we don't first establish the groundwork. To really understand how Adolf Hitler got to absolute power and how this conflict spiraled so quickly, we have to begin at the end of the last Great War.
And the disastrous, unworkable peace that followed it.
Right. So our mission here is to uncover precisely how that flawed peace treaty directly enabled the rise of the central figures of this coming conflict.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we're connecting this to the bigger picture, the Second World War was, you could almost say it was fundamentally the inevitable consequence of the failure to correctly conclude the first one.
That 1914 to 1918 conflict. The Great War.
The Great War, which is such a tragic misnomer. It was anything but great, and even more tragically, it was called the War to End All Wars.
The scale of that catastrophe it's just hard to grasp fully, even with 100 years of distance. When you look at the casualty figures alone, the numbers are just devastatingly personal.
They're staggering.
We're talking about approximately 40 million people who suffered injury, with at least half of those proving fatal. The human capital of an entire generation was just decimated.
And that profound traumatic cost, it directly shaped the immediate post-war push for peace.
Or what was supposed to be peace.
Well, it shaped it by driving the desire for retribution. The Great War ended with the armistice, signed at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918.
A very symbolic moment.
Very. But while this stopped the immediate fighting, Germany was in utter chaos. Following the defeat, the Kaiser was gone, he abdicated, and he was replaced by this very fragile new democratic government, the Weimar Republic.
And crucially, the victorious Allied forces, they kept their blockades up even after the armistice was signed.
Absolutely. And you can't overstate the importance of that. This economic pressure was immense. Imports, exports, they were all severely restricted, which prevented Germany from rebuilding its infrastructure, from feeding its people, or even stabilizing its economy.
Before the peace terms were even on the table.
Exactly. This economic strangulation, it just compounded the sense of national humiliation. It was pouring salt in the wound.
So in 1919, delegates from all over the world, they meet in Paris. And the hope, the stated goal, is to design a permanent world order that would guarantee harmony and unity.
And the core objective was undeniably admirable, to prevent a war like that from ever happening again. That's where the League of Nations comes from.
Right. But that effort culminated in the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919.
And this is the document that, as many historians now agree, ironically did more to cause the next war than to prevent it.
Even the setting for the signing was loaded.
Oh, absolutely. The magnificent Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, the historic palace of French royalty, it was loaded with symbolic malice. But the process itself was fundamentally flawed from the get-go because Germany was the only major country not permitted to participate in the negotiations.
So they weren't negotiating a peace, they were just brought in at the end to sign a document codifying their complete surrender and punishment.
That's it.
That immediately fosters this deep-seated national feeling of resentment and revenge
Mm-hmm.
that the sources describe. It's the ultimate insult to what was still, you have to remember, a proud, sophisticated empire-building nation.
Mm-hmm.
So what specific penalties did the sources identify as being the most damaging, the most unworkable?
Well, the list was long, and it was specifically designed to ensure Germany could never again rise as a military power. But the economic and psychological weight was crushing.
So let's start with the first one.
First, Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the entire conflict. This is the infamous War Guilt Clause.
The War Guilt Clause.
And this one clause fostered the stab-in-the-back myth among conservative and military circles in Germany.
Explain that myth. What was it?
It was this idea that the German army hadn't truly lost on the battlefield, that it was still capable of fighting, but had been betrayed by the civilian politicians back home who signed the peace.
So that myth was incredibly potent because it allowed people to externalize the blame, to reject the very legitimacy of the new democratic government, the Weimar Republic.
Precisely. And then came the economic ruin. They were required to pay vast sums reparations to the Allied nations for damages. This crushing debt, combined with that post-armistice blockade we mentioned, drove the German economy into utter chaos.
This is where we get the stories of hyperinflation in the early 1920s.
Mhm.
People using wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread.
Yes. The currency became worthless almost overnight. Germany was actively forbidden from economically recovering. It was punitive.
And territorially, they were dismantled.
Completely. They lost significant land and all their colonies. Land was relinquished to form new countries, most notably Poland, and to satisfy the territorial ambitions of France and Belgium.
And the military?
Wiped out. The treaty required them to disband their entire army, limit the remaining force to just 100,000 men, and strictly prohibit the manufacture of any armaments, tanks, or military aircraft. The Rhineland, that critical industrial area bordering France, was completely demilitarized.
So for a nation with such a distinguished military tradition, that complete disarmament coupled with the economic catastrophe and the moral guilt, it just guaranteed that the agreement, as the sources suggest, was doomed to fail.
An agreement only holds if all parties feel they have something to gain, or at least that some form of justice has been served.
And Germany felt only raw humiliation.
And that lack of foresight, that deliberately unworkable peace, created the absolute perfect political and psychological environment for extremist, radical views to take hold.
And Germany wasn't alone in feeling this resentment. The sources are clear that this dissatisfaction became the ideological foundation for what would become the Axis coalition.
That's right.
So if Versailles was designed to end war, the sources are basically saying it actually gave birth to a new, dangerous alliance. How did Germany, Italy, and Japan, three nations with such different histories, find common ground?
They all shared that feeling of being robbed of their rightful status and their territory. Italy, for instance, fought on the Allied side, but felt they should have gained much more territory in the peace settlement.
They felt shortchanged.
Very. And Imperial Japan, while also on the winning side, was furious about its failure to gain parts of China and felt like the European powers were overlooking them as a global power.
So what's so fascinating here is that these three dissatisfied, highly militaristic nations, Germany, Italy, Japan, they later formed the Axis coalition.
And they were all demanding the territory and the respect they felt Versailles had unjustly denied them. They were, in effect, the revisionist powers.
But it seems like the overwhelming mood among the actual populations who had endured the trenches, it was one of absolute deep-seated pacifism. People were just done with conflict.
For the most part, yes. Most nations developed that deep pacifist mentality. They swore they would never repeat the horrors of 1914 to 1918.
What?
The tragedy is that two men were inspired by the experience of the Great War. They saw it not as a warning, but as a blueprint for action. Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini.
And they shared these distorted, totalitarian views and a distinct fondness for fascism.
Posing a fundamental danger to the global community's desperate longing for peace, the stage was absolutely set.
And with that stage set, this deep well of national resentment, a failed democracy, a global depression looming into this volatile environment, steps Adolf Hitler. Our deep dive reveals this incredible irony. The man who would wage war on behalf of Germany was actually an Austrian by birth, born in 1889.
Right, and his personal history is critical here. It really connects his own sense of failure directly to the collective suffering of the German nation he adopted.
His early life was marked by failure and really profound hardship.
It was. After his parents died, he moved to Vienna, hoping to become a great artist. He failed miserably. He was rejected twice by the Academy of Fine Arts.
And he often ended up living in men's hostels, effectively sleeping on the streets for a time.
But this personal hardship wasn't something he internalized. It was immediately projected outward. He looked for someone to blame.
And his hatred really crystallized in that political environment of Vienna at the turn of the century. He was already blaming external forces for his troubles, and he fell in with these virulent anti-Semitic groups. He developed a deep-seated contempt for Jews, who he despised for occupying positions of cultural or economic power in the city.
His dislike of Austria and its, multi-ethnic nature, that became deeply entrenched.
So looking for a new start, finding solace in a more defined national identity, he leaves Austria for Munich, Germany in 1913.
And when World War I is declared the following year, he embraces it completely. He requests and receives permission to fight with the Bavarian Regiment of the German Army, and he becomes this intensely fierce patriot, a decorated soldier rising to the rank of corporal.
And so the German surrender in 1918 was, for him, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was a personal outrage.
Yes. The failure of the civilian government to back the army, that fueled his initial political motivation. He joins many of his comrades after the war, absolutely determined to fight for a restoration of his adopted homeland's power.
Not long after the Treaty of Versailles was ratified, Hitler starts his political career. He attends a meeting of the German Workers' Party.
And his gift for passionate, almost mesmerizing public oratory was immediately evident. That became his ultimate weapon.
He quickly takes charge of this tiny group, which is soon rebranded as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis.
The Nazi Party.
Yet, despite his speaking success, by 1923, he felt that political means were moving too slowly. So he attempts the infamous military coup in the Munich beer hall, the beer hall push.
Which was a complete disaster. It failed, and it led to his arrest.
He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but the short sentence he actually served, just 13 months, proved to be the pivotal, defining moment in his rise to power.
Absolutely.
Why was that period of incarceration so defining? What did it give him?
It provided him with two critical things: time to reflect and consolidate his message, and a national platform.
A platform from prison.
Yes, because during that time, he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And this book laid out his entire ideology, his racial hierarchy, his territorial ambitions, and his complete rejection of the Versailles system.
So this manifesto transforms him from just a local agitator in Munich into a figure of national significance, ready to capitalize on the next great catastrophe.
And that catastrophe came swiftly.
Europe had this brief period of prosperity in the mid-1920s, but that stability was completely shattered by the Wall Street crash in 1929.
And the resulting global economic crisis, the Great Depression, it hit Germany the hardest because of that existing burden of the Versailles war debt.
And the sources make it chillingly clear how this hardship provided Hitler with his political opportunity. The economic turmoil led previously rational people,
Millions of them.
millions of people struggling with massive unemployment, poverty, hunger. They start listening to his radical promises. Why?
Because the established democratic system had failed them, completely and utterly.
And his promise to rebuild the German military was the perfect, multifaceted appeal, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. It was a simultaneous solution to three problems. First, it was an act of national defiance against the hated Treaty of Versailles.
Right.
Second, it provided desperately needed jobs for hundreds of thousands of unemployed men. And third, it appealed to that deep-seated national desire for restored military pride.
He wasn't just promising recovery, he was promising revenge.
Exactly.
And his ascent was ruthless and swift once that economic opportunity opened up for him.
Yeah.
After the Reichstag fire in 1933, which he immediately and falsely blamed on the communists,
As an attempt to destroy the German state.
he used the resulting panic to consolidate legislative power.
And his position was permanently secured when President Hindenburg died in 1934. At that point, Hitler just merged the offices of president and chancellor. His power became absolute.
And the sheer accumulation of titles really speaks volumes about the totalitarian control he achieved.
He was head of state, commander-in-chief of German military forces, chancellor, and chief of the Nazi Party.
The German Führer was now supreme, with no constitutional checks left on his power.
And what's fascinating here is that once Hitler achieved that absolute power, he didn't wait. He began building his empire and systematically violating international law with alarming speed.
He was essentially daring the Allies, Britain and France, to enforce the very treaty that they had written.
He was testing them. And by 1935, the sources indicate he'd already abandoned the military restrictions. The army swelled to over 500,000 men. Production of arms, artillery, and aircraft had resumed openly.
It was just flouting the agreement that was supposed to ensure lasting peace. And the Allies, they were just watching.
He then pushed the envelope even further. In 1936, German military units reoccupied the Rhineland.
That demilitarized region bordering France.
Exactly. He violated treaty after treaty, moving in these calculated steps. But this is the crucial point. Despite these flagrant breaches, the rest of the world, specifically Britain and France, failed to take decisive action.
Why the inaction? The sources suggest Hitler was actually quite vulnerable at that stage. I mean, if the Allies had intervened militarily in the Rhineland, Germany's small, newly reorganized army would likely have been forced to retreat, wouldn't it?
Almost certainly. But the Allies missed that critical window for several interconnected reasons.
Such as?
First, military unpreparedness. Neither Britain nor France was ready for a large-scale conflict. They'd heavily demobilized after World War I. Second, economic factors. Engaging in a war would have been financially catastrophic, especially during the ongoing Depression.
And then there's the psychological element.
Perhaps the most powerful factor, the profound psychological scar of WWII. The political will simply did not exist to commit men to the trenches again, not over what many saw as a strip of German land.
They're just walking into their own backyard, was the phrase used.
It was. So, fueled by the knowledge that the Allies were paralyzed, Hitler began to accelerate his territorial acquisitions. In 1938, he announced his intention to march into Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland region.
And that triggered the Munich crisis.
Which put the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, in an impossible position. Chamberlain was deeply averse to war. He was determined to pay almost any price to avoid conflict.
So he opted for the desperate strategy of appeasement.
Appeasement. That became the official, desperate policy of the time. In September 1938, Chamberlain flies to Munich to meet Hitler, Mussolini, and the French Premier, Edouard Daladier.
And the resulting agreement was that Chamberlain allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland, a piece of sovereign Czechoslovakia, in exchange for a promise that Hitler would go no further.
It was a shocking betrayal of a democratic nation.
And Chamberlain comes home triumphant, believing he had secured peace in our time. He's waving the signed Munich Agreement, claiming it assured peace rather than war.
And the images of him being cheered by a grateful populace desperate to avoid conflict are famous. But this whole episode highlights the profound naivete of basing diplomacy on the perceived good faith of a leader who had systematically shown he operates entirely without it.
And this is where the narrative shifts so dramatically. Because while the populace celebrated, a lonely but resolute voice cut through it all.
Winston Churchill.
He was far from convinced and issued this profound prophecy.
Churchill's words were scathing. He claimed that Britain and France had a choice between war and dishonor, and that both nations had chosen dishonor.
And he predicted that by appeasing Hitler, they hadn't avoided war, they'd merely postponed it.
And ensured it would come at a far greater cost later.
Tragically, Churchill was proven correct just 6 months later. On March 15, 1939, without warning, the Nazis march into the rest of Czechoslovakia.
They take Prague and completely extinguish the independent Czech state.
And Chamberlain had to face the full horror of reality. His policy had failed spectacularly. Hitler's word was utterly meaningless.
With that lesson finally learned, though far too late, Hitler immediately turned his attention to Germany's eastern neighbor, Poland. And he knew that the British and French had given guarantees to Poland.
Which meant that any move there would inevitably trigger a major conflict. The line had been drawn.
The line had been drawn.
So before Hitler could strike Poland, he had one massive strategic hurdle to clear. He had to neutralize the risk of a two-front war against the Soviet Union.
The symbolism of this next move is truly breathtaking. Despite their deep ideological hatred, Nazism versus communism, Hitler and the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin agreed to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact in August 1939.
A deal with the devil.
For both of them. And this pact, which included secret protocols carving up Eastern Europe between them, laid the road to war wide open. It ensured Germany wouldn't face Soviet retaliation when it invaded Poland.
So in the early morning hours of September 1st, 1939, with the Soviet flank secured, an overwhelming German force mobilized. The scale was just massive.
Over 1 million troops, backed by tactical aircraft and speedy panzer tank divisions, swarming into Poland using a coordinated three-front approach.
And this was the official debut of a radical, terrifying new tactical maneuver. The Blitzkrieg.
The Blitzkrieg.
Let's do a deep dive on this. Blitzkrieg, or lightning strike, was developed conceptually by officers like Hans Guderian and championed by Hitler. It was explicitly designed to avoid that static, drawn-out trench warfare that had defined WWI.
Where tiny gains cost millions of lives, the essence of Blitzkrieg was speed, surprise, and coordinated maneuverability.
So the whole point was to storm in quickly and create instantaneous havoc and panic.
By utilizing a seamlessly integrated multi-layered attack combining air and ground forces, it wasn't just a big push forward, it was a system shock to the enemy.
Okay, so walk us through the specific phases of the Blitzkrieg mechanism as it was used in Poland.
Okay, phase one was isolation and psychological shock. The Air Force, the Luftwaffe, led the charge. Specifically, the Stuka-Geiv bombers.
The ones with the sirens.
Yes, the sirens whose distinct wail was designed to terrify ground troops. They flew in first. Their target wasn't the main army line, but the infrastructure behind it. Railway lines, communication centers, bridges, command structures.
So they were literally decapitating the command and control capabilities of the Polish army. If you can't communicate, you can't coordinate a defense. Panic takes hold immediately among isolated units.
Exactly. Then phase two followed immediately. The armored units, the panzers, acted as the spearhead. These divisions, equipped with superior radio communication, would punch deep into enemy territory, exploiting the chaos created by the Stukas.
So they bypassed areas of heavy resistance. They didn't get bogged down.
No, they avoided it. They focused on deep penetration, creating chaos in the rear.
This is a radical departure from WWI tactics, where the infantry was sent in first to soften up the trenches.
It is. The infantry came last. They traveled rapidly behind the panzers in motorized vehicles to secure the captured territory and mop up any isolated pockets of resistance.
So the goal was simple: defeat the target nation before it could even mobilize a proper defense or establish a stable front line.
And Poland, relying largely on traditional cavalry units and slower mobilization methods, stood absolutely no chance against this mechanical juggernaut.
With the Blitzkrieg underway, Neville Chamberlain had no choice left. He issued his ultimatum.
Germany was to withdraw from Polish soil by 11 a.m. on the morning of September 3rd, or war would be declared.
And when Hitler refused to acknowledge the demand, the clock ran out.
Just 15 minutes after that deadline passed, Chamberlain made the solemn announcement from 10 Downing Street.
And that moment is etched into history. Speaking directly from the cabinet room, his declaration was unequivocal, making it clear that all hope of peace was gone.
This country is at war with Germany.
The declaration was immediately global, wasn't it? It showed the scale of the British Empire's commitment.
Yes, the nations of the Commonwealth, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and India all stood ready to support the declaration. France followed suit a few hours later.
The long road to war, started by that flawed Treaty of Versailles, had finally reached its devastating conclusion.
And as war broke out, whatever past mistakes Neville Chamberlain had made in foreign policy, the sources suggest he made one immediate, crucial decision.
He asked Winston Churchill to return to government.
He asked Churchill, the man who had argued so vigorously and so accurately against the policy of appeasement, to return to his former post as First Lord of the Admiralty.
A role he last held in 1916.
The political establishment knew Churchill was the only one who possessed the strategic vision and the political fortitude to face Hitler.
Churchill's return must have provided an enormous immediate morale boost, especially to the Navy. He had spent his political wilderness years not just criticizing appeasement, but warning about German rearmament.
The sources confirm that the feeling within the naval command was electric. The folklore that the Admiralty flashed a jubilant message to its ships, "Winston is back," that reflects the sheer enthusiasm. Churchill, despite being at retirement age, was seen as this unique, dynamic character capable of changing the course of history through the sheer force of his personality and his strategic genius.
His presence alone must have cut through that passive defensive mood that had defined the Chamberlain government.
It did, and his immediate importance was underscored by a naval tragedy that occurred on the very same day he took command.
The sinking of the Athenia.
The Athenia, a British passenger liner carrying over 1,000 civilians, including nearly 300 Americans, on its way from Glasgow to Canada. It was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat, 118 civilian deaths.
And the key detail here is the clear violation of International Maritime Convention, which forbids firing on passenger ships without warning.
The U-boat commander, Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp, likely mistook the Athenia for a troop transport, but the act itself was still criminal. He fired 2 torpedoes, maintained complete radio silence, and just fled the scene without offering aid. The news sparked immediate, massive international outrage.
And the reaction from Hitler's regime is what tells us so much about the nature of this new conflict. It was a war fought on the information front just as much as on the battlefield.
Oh, absolutely. The Nazi propaganda machine, run by Joseph Goebbels, went into overdrive. Hitler denied all knowledge of the sinking and ordered the submarine's logbook secretly rewritten to hide the truth,
And Goebbels launched this massive disinformation campaign.
claiming it was a torpedo from a British submarine that had hit the Athenia.
They later escalated the lie, didn't they? They claimed it was a cynical publicity stunt orchestrated by Churchill himself to discredit Germany and pull the isolationist United States into the war.
Which proves beyond a doubt that the new First Lord of the Admiralty was already making waves in the international arena.
And this highlights a crucial theme of this deep dive.
Yeah.
Alongside the physical war, a strategic information war began on day one.
Attempting to influence global opinion, especially in the U.S., whose eventual participation was critical to both sides.
Meanwhile, as the battle for supremacy at sea started in deadly earnest, the first British air assault from the RAF was launched on September 4th. But the sources note it was a pretty rocky start for the Royal Air Force.
A very rocky start. Out of 29 bombers scrambled to strike German naval bases, only 8 even managed to reach their targets. Navigation was poor, planes got lost, they attacked the wrong ships.
They just lacked the real-world combat experience of the Luftwaffe.
The Luftwaffe had used the Spanish Civil War to rigorously test and refine their tactical aircraft and their bomber escort coordination. The RAF was coming in cold.
And the initial operational confusion was maybe best summarized 2 days later when a false air raid alert sounded over the UK.
Yes, the sheer panic and inexperience led to several Hurricanes and Spitfires launching, only to end up shooting each other down with absolutely no enemy planes in sight.
A tragic friendly fire incident.
This early period was defined by tragedy and confusion, not competence. It was a steep learning curve.
Yet, despite the tragedy and the false starts, after the initial shock of the war declaration, life in Britain settled into this uneasy pattern. This is what historians call the phony war.
The lull before the storm. Many of the children evacuated from cities quickly returned home, believing the immediate threat had passed.
But the routine of war was still established. Curfews became commonplace, and strict nightly blackouts were rigidly enforced to prevent German bombers from finding targets.
Street lighting was turned off, motorists were forbidden from using headlamps, which tragically resulted in a number of casualties from road accidents. Britain was just waiting, tense and uncertain, for the real action to begin.
And while Britain and France experienced the bizarre stasis of the phony war, the sources make it chillingly clear that for the people of Poland, this was absolute, horrific reality of total war.
No phony war for them.
No, they faced the full force of the mechanized German war machine and the immediate systematic atrocities that followed.
There was no escaping it. The initial military conquest was immediately followed by Operation Tannenburg.
Which was what?
It involved mass executions targeting political opponents, intellectuals, clergy, anyone who might organize resistance. The initial death toll was reported at more than 20,000 ruthless killings.
And even facing this overwhelming violence, what was left of the Polish militia and civilian volunteers, they mounted this fierce but doomed defense of Warsaw.
And their fate was sealed on September 17th. That's when the Soviet Red Army invaded Poland from the east, fulfilling Stalin's side of the non-aggression pact.
So Poland was attacked on two fronts.
40 massive divisions, 800,000 men, swarmed in. It made organized Polish resistance impossible. Stalin was determined to claim the territory secretly promised to him by Hitler.
But amidst this disaster, there was one piece of crucial good fortune for the Allies, though its value wouldn't be realized for some time.
The Enigma escape.
The Enigma escape, absolutely vital.
Members of the Polish Cipher Bureau, who had this inside knowledge of the complex Enigma code the Germans used for many of their secret communications, they managed to escape the advancing Russians.
With two of their Enigma machines.
They arrived safely in Paris on October 1st, and the intelligence gained from this source, which was codenamed Ultra, would eventually prove to be the most significant intelligence asset of the entire Allied war effort. It enabled codebreakers to anticipate German military movements throughout the conflict.
But for Poland, it was too late.
Poland was quickly overwhelmed. Warsaw was bombed into submission by the low-flying Luftwaffe, the air force Hitler had built in direct violation of Versailles, and surrendered unconditionally on September 27th.
And just 1 day later, Poland was callously partitioned by Germany and Russia.
The numbers of that partition are sobering. Hitler claimed almost 73,000 square miles of territory, tragically home to nearly 2 million Jews. Russia, meanwhile, swallowed 78,000 square miles and subsequently annexed the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia.
And the military losses for the victors were minimal.
But the true horror lies in what happened immediately after the conquest. The start of systematic atrocity and the chilling blueprint for genocide, starting in October 1939. This is where the Polish experience fundamentally diverged from the phony war.
This is the darkest segment of the sources. Hitler immediately set up the German-occupied territory in Poland as the general government, viewing Poles as an alien population dangerous to the Reich that needed to be enslaved or eliminated.
The ideological goal was the racial purification of the conquered eastern territories. And what had started much earlier in Germany with the enforced euthanasia of the elderly and mentally ill code-named Aktion T4 was now aggressively expanded into the occupied territories.
The sources detail how this systematic evil began to focus on the most vulnerable.
It was the job of doctors and midwives to register any child born with any kind of mental or physical deficiency. This allowed Hitler's officials to decide who lived or died. This process of elimination was deemed ideologically necessary to create the perfect Aryan nation.
It's just chilling.
Furthermore, questionnaires were aggressively distributed to anyone without German citizenship, spreading this regime of terror and identifying groups for elimination. But the most horrifying connection is a technical one.
What do you mean?
The experience gained using gas chambers in these euthanasia killing centers, whether in Germany or occupied territory, served as training for the SS.
So this was the chilling technical blueprint for the Holocaust.
Exactly. The sources emphasize that this elite band of Nazis, the Führer's Praetorian Guard under Heinrich Himmler's command, they utilized this expertise to implement Hitler's final solution of systematic genocide.
And while the extermination of the Jewish population is rightly the focus, the sources remind us that communists, ethnic Poles, homosexuals, and Freemasons were also viciously targeted.
The technological know-how gained during Aktion T4 was tragically applied in the construction of massive killing centers like Auschwitz and Treblinka. And of the approximately 6 million European Jews murdered during the Holocaust, a disproportionate number were Polish.
Meanwhile, the immediate policy in Poland was persecution. The Nazis began rounding up the Jewish population, confining them to localized, massively overcrowded ghettos in cities like Warsaw.
They created endless restrictive and degrading laws. The sources mention, for example, making the simple act of wearing a felt hat punishable by death. This calculated campaign of humiliation and terror began immediately upon conquest.
So as 1939 moved into November, Hitler, despite his massive successes in Poland, still harbored hopes for a negotiated settlement with the British.
It seems so. Perhaps he believed they would simply accept his gains. But Chamberlain, having finally learned the lesson from the debacle of the Munich Treaty, he rejected these insincere peace proposals on October 12th.
He told the British public that no promises from Hitler or the present German government should be believed or accepted as fact.
However, this learning was arguably limited, wasn't it? Because the Allies continued to maintain a passive, watching and waiting brief, rather than seizing the initiative and becoming proactively aggressive against the Nazis.
They were still reacting, not acting.
Indeed. And while the Allies waited for Hitler's next move, November saw a dramatic event suggesting that not all of Germany was on board with the Führer, the first of a number of failed assassination attempts on Hitler's life.
And this occurred in the same Munich beer hall where Hitler had attempted his 1923 military coup.
The symmetry is incredible. The bomb detonated 20 minutes after Hitler had unexpectedly left early, killing 8 people. Had he stayed, the course of history would have been dramatically altered.
And the perpetrator, Georg Elser, he was arrested trying to cross into Switzerland.
The sources reveal he appears to have acted alone, motivated by this deep outrage that the German people had lost so much personal freedom, even control over their children's education, which was now governed by organizations like the Hitler Youth.
That detail, that resistance was motivated by the loss of freedom over one's own children. It really shows the pervasive nature of the terror within Germany itself.
It does. Meanwhile, the global conflict was widening, thanks to Hitler's unlikely ally, Joseph Stalin,
who distrusted Hitler profoundly.
Absolutely. Although the Non-Aggression Pact enabled the invasion of Poland, Stalin immediately moved to secure his own defensive perimeter. Having secured eastern Poland, the Russians turned their attention to Finland, seeking a tactical buffer zone to protect the vulnerable city of Leningrad from any potential attack.
So when the battle lines were drawn between Russia and Finland by the end of November, the Soviet Red Army believed they had an easy task ahead.
They adopted an offensive style similar to the Blitzkrieg. anticipating a quick victory against the small, sparsely populated Finnish nation.
But this conflict, known as the Winter War, proved to be a severe shock to the Soviets. It highlighted their massive weaknesses.
The winter of 1939 was one of the worst on record, and the Finns, though small in number, used their fierce patriotic determination and their knowledge of the hostile terrain, the dense forests, the deep snow, to their immense advantage.
So how did the Finns, so vastly outnumbered, manage to hold off the Soviet giant?
They employed specific small-unit tactics known as Madi tactics. It's named after a Finnish word for a log pile. So instead of fighting head-on, the Finns would use skis to move rapidly through the snow, wearing white camouflage, and they would isolate massive Soviet divisions into small, cut-off pockets. These Madi were then systematically eliminated by highly mobile, localized groups.
So this sounds like the perfect counter to the Soviet military's inherent weaknesses.
It was. The Russian weaknesses were crippling. Their troops, often sent from southern Russia, were ill-equipped for the extreme cold. More critically, the command structure was slow and rigid.
How so?
Unlike the decentralized panzer divisions in Germany, Soviet commanders in the field could not make immediate tactical decisions without approval from a higher, often distant authority. This led to fatal delays.
So the Soviet army was like a slow-moving dinosaur, hindered by both the unforgiving Finnish geography and its own bureaucratic rigidity.
Precisely. And they lacked white camouflage, making them easy targets against the snow. Their vehicles struggled relentlessly in the freezing conditions, which limited their attack routes to predictable roads. Even the Russian Air Force was hindered by the short winter days and took heavy casualties, losing nearly 800 planes.
So the conflict just dragged on.
Proving that sheer manpower alone could be stymied by poor preparation and fierce, intelligent resistance.
And switching back to the West, December saw the Royal Navy become embroiled in the first major naval battle of the South Atlantic, the Battle of the River Plate.
This involved the German pocket battleship Graf Spee, and this ship is an incredible example of naval engineering designed around the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles.
Which had forbidden Germany from building large classic battleships.
Right, so the Graf Spee was compact, fast enough to outrun superior battleships, and heavily armed. It made it a potent commerce raider against merchant shipping in the Atlantic.
So the British Navy responded by dispatching a squadron of cruisers, the Ajax, Exeter, Cumberland, and Achilles.
And they managed to track and engage the dangerous German craft, eventually forcing the Graf Spee into the neutral port of Montevideo, Uruguay, though the British cruiser Exeter was badly damaged in the engagement.
But the true victory here wasn't about firepower, was it? It was about intelligence.
Exactly. Captain Hans Langsdorff, the commander of the Graf Spee, was under a strict time limit on how long he could stay in the neutral port. British intelligence operatives managed to feed him misinformation,
convincing him that a far superior fleet, including a battlecruiser, was immediately imminent.
Yes. And determined to save his crew from what he believed would be certain slaughter, Langsdorff scuttled the ship outside the harbor entrance.
And tragically, 3 days later, he committed suicide.
An act the sources suggest was driven by the shame of losing his ship without a fight. Yet it also highlights his honor by prioritizing his crew's lives.
This December action coincided with the final symbolic act of the League of Nations.
The international peacekeeping body, the brainchild of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, had proven utterly ineffective throughout the decade. Unable to protect China or Abyssinia, powerless against German rearmament.
And Germany and Japan had already voluntarily withdrawn in 1933, Italy in 1937. As the world faced a global conflict that no group of peacekeepers could hope to pacify, the organization just faded.
Its final act was expelling Russia for invading Finland. Although the U.S. remained officially neutral, President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke out forcefully against the Soviet invasion, and the League followed suit by formally condemning and expelling Russia. The mechanisms of collective security had completely collapsed.
So as 1939 grew to a close, the lull before the storm was visibly ending. Britain expanded conscription twice in 2 weeks, calling up men aged 19 to 41 and accepting women aged 20 to 30 for auxiliary service.
And the Commonwealth commitment solidified. Over 7,000 Canadian troops arrived, and soldiers from India were dispatched to France. The pieces were moving on the board.
This deep dive really shows just how quickly the political landscape collapsed. Moving from the foundational political failure of the Versailles Treaty and the dangerous naivete of appeasement.
Right into the brutal realities of total mechanized warfare and systematic atrocity. And all in just 4 months.
The war at sea, the propaganda battles, the failed assassination attempts, the sheer mechanical ruthlessness of the Blitzkrieg, it all signaled that this was going to be a conflict defined by speed and ideological elimination.
Completely different from the last war, and far more pervasive.
And even as the year closed, Churchill continued to speak out against Britain's defensive inaction.
For the First Lord of the Admiralty, the best form of defense was an aggressive posture. He was desperately worried that the Germans were about to target Norway.
To secure the iron ore supply they needed for their massive industrial war machine.
Exactly. Yet Chamberlain ignored these grave warnings, mirroring the tragic mistake of 1938. It was as if the lessons of the Munich Treaty were constantly being forgotten. He just continued to wait for what Hitler would do next.
And the political costs of that passivity would soon become apparent in 1940. Here's where it gets really interesting.
The sources reveal the simultaneous existence of two completely different wars being fought in late 1939. On one hand, you had the relatively limited conventional war at sea and in the air fought by Britain, characterized by curfews and blackouts, the Funny War. On the other, you had the brutal genocidal war of conquest being waged by Hitler and Stalin in Poland, characterized by mass executions, forced ghettos, and the initial clinical blueprint for the Holocaust. Which of those two emerging conflicts truly define the future of the decade, and what does it take for political leaders to shift focus from defense to preemptive action when facing an enemy who fundamentally rejects diplomacy and intends total systematic elimination? That is the question you are left to mull over.